I want people to understand that the most important thing that they can do is not rely on their natural mental processes to remember information. And that's because as humans, we forget up to 80% of what we hear, see, and learn within a few hours of hearing, seeing, and learning it.
Man of Mastery Podcast, episode 39 with Kam Knight. Guys, what is up? Hope you're having an incredible week so far. Welcome back to the show, the podcast, the tribe, the community, where we are all about rejecting mediocrity, living your passions, uncovering your purpose through action in service to others. I really appreciate you being here and your time and your trust. If you're new, you are right on time here. We're really starting to pick up some momentum and rolling into 2020. And speaking of 2020, if you're anything like me, man, I have started the year off with probably a few breakthroughs, but certainly a number of breakdowns. I'm trying to get back on a consistent intermittent daily fasting routine. I ran my first race of the season this last weekend and got absolutely crushed. It's a great reminder in that failure or, kind of lessons learned there that there's work to be done. And likewise, I stepped on the scale for the first time in a while the other day, and it definitely told me the same thing. So as much as we like to talk about the success journey and events, I think it's important to be transparent about the challenges and the failures as well. So just getting that out there. If nothing else for myself, a recommitment to just get after it here early in the new year and get it going the right way. And to that end, I hope to have some things coming up that might also be helpful for you in that. For me, that's kind of the physical realm. But today in particular, I talk about mind, body, and soul. Today's kind of more about the mind. Kam Knight is a guy who certainly knows adversity, who knows failure. He's become very, very well read and studied, and talks to us today, synthesizes that knowledge and that experience to talk about emotions, anxiety, how to harness fear. Talks about memory and why the brain does what it does, how to improve memory and recollection, how to improve concentration. It even talks about, we get into speed reading, something that's always fascinated me as a concept, but I always kind of thought, I don't know, maybe it's a gimmick. So we talk about some simple techniques to start speed reading and learning faster. So I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Let's hear what Kam Knight's experience has been and what he can bring to us in the realm of harnessing the power of the mind. All right, today I'm really excited and pleased to have coach and best-selling author Kam Knight. He is an expert in mental performance in areas such as memory, concentration, and productivity. His work is about unlocking the secrets of the mind and optimizing performance. So this is a perfect fit to what we talk about in the theme of the Man of Mastery podcast and community here, learning and applying ways to improve performance in all domains of our lives. So Kam, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I know you've got a number of topics, a number of books. In terms of where to start, I know one of the things I love to learn about is where people have turned failure into learning lessons and success. Or one of the things that always sticks in my mind is Tony Robbins likes to say that change happens either by inspiration or desperation. So could you give us a bit of your background story and how you talk about where you had struggles with focus and controlling emotion and the things that learned you to discover, which you now teach others?
Sure. So I've got like two main running stories of how I got into this. One is that as far back as I could remember, I had a very unquiet mind. I had a lot of challenges sitting still, organizing my thoughts, paying attention. Anything that revolved around the mind, I had extreme difficulty doing. And when people hear this, they immediately think ADD. And what I respond with is, I wish it were only ADD, because in addition to my thoughts and what was going on in my head, my emotions were raging and more or less cycling out of control. And when people hear that, they think bipolar. And to my response, I wish it were only that. And because it was much more severe than that. I was just in a place where, like, mentally and emotionally, I was just a mess. I really had no control of my thoughts as well as other things in my life. And when you're a kid, this is kind of almost expected to be a little bit hyper, a little bit out of control. And the expectancy is that as you grow up, these are phases that you grow out of. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case for me. As I got older into high school and then college and then graduating, it actually got worse, and it kind of affected literally all areas of my life, personal, professional, as well as academic. And I've always had a strong drive. And so I've always been able to kind of contain this mayhem, because mayhem is the perfect word to be able to do what I wanted, just long enough to get the results I needed. So, for example, studying for an exam, I could kind of control it and focus just long enough to do well and get into college and then to the real world. But then in the real world, it just became just too much. So I just got on a path of trying to figure this out and been on a healing journey for a while. And that's what what I have in my book is what I've learned through that journey.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly challenging, and somehow you were able to keep it together for quite a while until you're really faced with the rest after school, the rest of life and career challenges. So, where did you start in terms of learning and self healing?
Well, I started with some audio tapes. So after I graduated college, I got my first job, and I was extremely, extremely nervous about it. And I remember being at Barnes and Nobles, and I was at the audio section, and I saw these tapes. One said managing anxiety, and another said overcoming fear. And I'm like, I need that. So I bought the tapes, went home, and started listening to them. And they turned out to be like affirmation slash visualization scripts where they put you in a relaxation exercise, and then you affirm a bunch of statements, and then you do a few visualization exercises. And I just made it a point to do that on a daily basis. I didn't know much about affirmations. I didn't know much about visualizations, and I didn't really know much about personal development. That was like really my first step into the whole thing. And then afterwards, I came across a few books, some older books, and one of them was Power of the Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy, and another one was What to Say When You Talk to Yourself by Chad Helmstetter. And they were talking about visualization and self-talk, and I'm like, I do that. And so they talked about the science of why it works and why it's so beneficial. So I kept at it. And then from there, I came across other books. And then from there, it just kind of added on top of it. But really, the foundations for me were the self talk and visualization.
Yeah, I really like that. I have to think as you travel around now and you share your book and your story and your teachings, and I know you've traveled extensively, you must run across a number of people who express the same challenges. I think life's gotten so busy. We're caught up in 24-hour news cycle, constant, if not addiction, the attention required by things like all of our devices and communication mechanisms. So with the world racing at the pace it is and our brains racing to try to keep up, what maybe you had that seemed a bit unique as you were growing up, do you find that's a challenge for many people now?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I think one of the challenge right now for people in our current society and in our time is just the sheer level of options that we have. And our options have options. So, for example, if I wanted to go work out, my options are running, bicycling, swimming, weightlifting, yoga. And within that, we have all these options let's say, within yoga, I could do Bikram yoga, Ashtanga, Vinyasa, Baptiste, Yin. And within those, there are variations. And it's like really easy to get lost in all the variations. And that's just if we're trying to focused on his particular task. That doesn't even include all these side activities that are just there to fill our downtime, like social media and video games. And it can become a bit much.
Overwhelming, even paralyzing, you might say.
Paralyzing, yes.
And you mentioned fear, which is really interesting to me. So I spoke to a guest not too long ago named Patrick Sweeney, and he calls himself the fear guru.
Hmm.
And the reason is, and something I learned from him about fear is, so this guy was performing at seemingly a fairly top level in life, sort of Olympic level athlete as a younger man, and then successful technology entrepreneur, and then his health and life really came down crashing down around him. And when he had that opportunity for some introspection and to figure out he beat cancer and how he was going to live the rest of his life, what he realized is really everything he had done, the ways he acted socially, the choices he made in career, some of this overachieving sort of result, it was all driven by fear and sort of avoidance behavior. And so he's gone out and studied that, and he's really spent his years since then trying to figure out how to do the opposite of that, how to train courage, how to learn to face fears. And so he's got a book coming out called Fear as Fuel that
Hmm.
you might want to check out. I think it's Q1 coming up this year. But it's a really interesting concept that fear and all these things that can be so paralyzing in our lives don't have to be that way. There are ways that we can train the mind to actually turn that around and use it as an asset.
Yeah, no, fear, I think when you were, not I think, but as you were talking about what he was going through, like all the things that he did was out of fear and avoiding the consequences of fear. I felt like you were talking about me because in many ways that was how my life was running too. It was by fear. And I believe that there's kind of four main fears that are driving us. It's the fear of rejection, it's the fear of failure, it's the fear of the unknown, and the fear of success. And the thing to understand about fear is that it's there not to make our life bad, but to help us. It's there to guide us. And a lot of misconceptions we have around fear is that we need to get rid of fear, we need to overcome fear. But I personally believe it's important to befriend the fear because fear is running through us all the time. Even something like when we're walking into a room, fear is guiding it's coursing through our bodies to help us maneuver around the objects in that room, like the tables and chairs. So if we get too close to the table, fear will run part of the body where we're close to it to indicate we're getting too close. And if we're doing something else, like even in conversation, our fear is coming in and out to make sure that what we say comes out coherently and that it's not too offensive. So fear is like always there. And if we can understand that it's always there and I kind of accept that it's there to help and guide us, and then if we can do that, it can help become more of an assistance in our lives versus something that we have to push past and overcome.
Yeah,
Does that make
that's
sense?
it does make sense. It's a really interesting point to think about. I sometimes think of fear. So I agree, it can really be a tool, and certainly at one level, it's there for just biological preservation,
Right.
right? As you know, just kind of think of the sort of animal kingdom sort of dangers, but in at least in first world society, that's not as much of the way that we need to use fear today. So, in the ways that we can use it as a tool to guide us, I think you make some really good points. The um, in particular around the unknowns, I think that's something that I've tried to tackle. Where I find that oftentimes fear is a great indication, maybe of something that you might want to run towards. You know, if it's really
Right.
not truly something that's potentially harmful to your life or health, it might be an indication of an opportunity to grow, but
Right.
that oftentimes that unknown can be our mind runs away with it and you just make something way bigger out of it than it really is.
Yes, and it helps really understand where this fear of unknown comes from. And I will even say, I think the most powerful force in our life would be the fear of unknown. And the reason it's so powerful is because, when we go back to our hunter-gatherer days, when we're out in the wild, dangers could come out of anywhere. They could come from, a lion leaping out of the bushes, from a bacteria in the water, from even the weather being too harsh. So you didn't know where the mind didn't know where the danger would come from. So anytime we do something new, this fear of unknown comes up over. It's like a blanket fear that just tells you to be careful. And it's not saying be careful of some specific thing, but it's the mind is pretty much unsure of what could come up. And now in our day and age, especially in modern society, a lot of those dangers aren't there. So it's easy to do new things without there being severe consequences. But we're still carrying out processes and mechanisms that were built as if things are going to be really catastrophic. And so anytime we try something new, even if it's a new restaurant or even if it's a new book, anything that's new, the fear of the unknown will come up. And it'll come up for some people as intensely as it would if we were back out in the wild. But it's important to realize that as even though it's really intense, that feeling of fear of the unknown doesn't mean that the outcome is gonna be as severe. And if we can learn to just kind of push past that fear of unknown and do it consistently, over time, the mind realizes that new things aren't as dangerous as they seem. And this is kind of what I've done, having traveled as much as I have, and then pushing myself into becoming an author and speaker, and now podcasting. I've had to push through unknowns quite a lot. And I just have a mindset if there's something new, I will try it just to get over that fear of unknown. And over time, it's helped me try more new things. And I'll be honest, not everything works out, but it's not like back in the hunter gatherer days where it would be catastrophic. All it means is that I try it again or try something else.
Yeah, exactly. There's a there's a great book I've read a while ago. I think it's called The Gift of Fear, that is along the lines of starting to train that muscle of
Mhm.
recognizing which of those fears is really something that I should listen to because maybe
Mm.
there's really a danger, and the recognition of those other categories that's probably most of life for most of us most of the time, which is that heart rate gets going and the adrenaline pumps, and the mind is racing in that sort of fight or flight mode that comes across biologically. So there are all these
Yeah.
biological markers that happen with that fear, but starting to train the mind to understand that most of the time this isn't a life or death fear. This probably is something that would help me grow and help me develop. So that the mindset, or I call it kind of training that mental muscle, is a great exercise, but it is something that has to be trained.
Yeah, exactly. I think you hit on a really important point. Our fears and even our other emotions, they seem like they're there to kind of like make life difficult, but at their very core, they're there to help us. They're there to help and guide us. But it's really important to have a sort of a relationship with it because, a fear will come up and then you'll analyze why this fear is coming up. You can break it down into the four different fears I had mentioned: fear of rejection, success, unknown, and the other one I can't think of. But and then once you realize why that fear is coming up, and you still take action, and then you notice that nothing bad happened, well, that fear learns, that emotion learns not to come up again in that situation. And over time, when you go back and forth working with that with the fear, then there's a relationship that forms where it doesn't come up when nothing bad's going to happen, and it'll come up when in the past you did make a mistake and things didn't go well, as a warning, and you can say, yeah, it didn't work out so well then, but this time it'll be different, and then try again.
Right. Well, you mentioned fear and visualization sort of at the same time in your introduction. So, in terms of tools and ways to start to train what you just described, have you used visualization as one of those tools? Is that one way that you've addressed fear?
Yeah, visualization has been really key in my development, especially getting over a lot of my emotions, including the emotion of fear. And I'm sure you've heard of visualization before. It kind of gets talked about a lot, or actually, there was a certain point it got talked about quite a bit, but I don't feel like it's being talked about as much. So, anytime I'm doing something new or something that's difficult, I will actually visualize myself doing it. And there's a few ways I will do that. One is to just imagine that thing that is causing me intense anxiety, and I'll picture myself in there. For example, recently I got onto trying to become a professional speaker or public speaker. And for a long time, this was an extremely terrifying endeavor for me. Like I avoided it like it was a plague. In fact, in my adult life, I don't think I've ever really had to get in front of an audience. And I made sure that I didn't or avoided any opportunity that would allow me to. But now, as an author, it's important for me to do that. And the way I would do that to get over the fear is I would close my eyes and then I would just actually imagine myself giving the speech or presentation to the audience and letting that fear come up. And I would continue to deliver the presentation standing in that fear. And then sometimes what I would do is just pay attention to the fear and not actually work about think about the presentation. I would just create the visual image of me standing in front of an audience, which would feel scary. And then the fearful emotions would come up. And I would just notice and observe that emotion. And what I realized is that our emotions, they just want to be noticed. Again, they're not trying to make our life difficult. They're there to guide us. And so when an emotion comes up, especially something like an intense fear, their purpose is that they're trying to get our attention. And what a lot of times we do is we try to suppress it, we try to shut it out, and we try to ignore it. And if the purpose of an emotion is to communicate to us and it comes up to communicate and we shut it out, guess what happens? It's going to try harder to get our attention. And so what that means is it grows stronger in intensity. And so a lot of times our emotions get stronger not because the situation is that intense or that the situation that's causing the fear is that severe, but mainly because we're not paying attention to the emotions. We're not listening to it. We're not heeding what it's trying to communicate. And once we do, it tends to subside. So, a great way to trigger that fear is to visualize yourself in a situation that causes you fear and then just pay attention to it. Just put your attention on it and just notice it, what it's trying to communicate. And you'll get a lot of data from that.
That intuitively makes a lot of sense. I don't think I've thought about it exactly that way before. I'll have to give that a try. Do you have So you gave an example of a particular activity. So as launching into book tour and being an author, public speaking, which the surveys say that many people fear that more than death.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. And so that was around a particular, let's say, professional pursuit or activity or things that were going to come up on a scheduled periodic basis. Do you have anything that you like to break down as well in a daily routine? So I'd like to know in general about your maybe morning, evening, intraday routine if you have one. But in particular, do you proactively use visualization as part of a regular, maybe daily routine?
Yeah. So visualization is great for how I had just described, overcoming like an intense emotion where you visualize yourself in an intense situation and just let that emotion come up without trying to change it, and more importantly, just observing it. But it can be used other ways too. One of the ways that's been kind of talked about a lot within the realm of manifestation and law of attraction, like such as the secret, is visualizing the outcome that you would like to that you desire. But another way, which I like to use as a routine every morning, is I think about everything that I want to get done or accomplish in that day. So in the evening, I write down all the stuff that I have on my plate for the next day. And then the next morning when I wake up, I actually visualize myself doing each of those items and accomplishing each of those items and it going well. Even if I don't, even if my emotions are saying, this might not go well, this might not come through, this might be a waste of time. I put that to the side and just visualize myself doing the best I can with each of the items and going from one to the next, making sure I've completed it. Now, it might seem like it'll take a long time to do this, but it actually doesn't. Once you get up in the morning, there's some like lingering time that we, all of us, kind of just do laying in bed for a little bit. And that's the best moment to just take about 10 minutes to visualize all your to-dos for that day.
I like that. Are you there's an author and a coach who's been a coach of mine, and because I've learned a good bit from his material, I mention him quite often. But two things that came up. So I want to find out, have you had any familiarity with Mark Divine? Have you heard of him?
No, I can't say I have.
So he happens to be out here in the San Diego area as well. Retired from a military background, special forces military, and then although he's quite well known for that background, he's almost equally, if not more, sort of a yoga, best practices in human development, sort of global service oriented mindset is what he does now. Author, speaker, coach. And on the fear aspect, he pulls from a Native American story about two wolves, the fear wolf and the courage wolf, and it's a way to visualize this embodiment of am I feeding fear or am I feeding courage, is what he talks about. And then the reason I thought of it in particular, as you talked about how you attack maybe an acute fear like speaking, or just proactively your day, his what he calls that is that visualization he calls winning first in your mind. So
Mhm.
first mentally seeing how you're going to, as you said, not only do those things but accomplish them and have them go well.
Yeah. And there was a famous psychologist named, I'm going to butcher his name. He was a French psychologist. I think his name was Emile Coué. And he said, when there's a conflict between will and your mental images, it's the mental images that always win. And what that means is if you have the desire for something more, to finish something, and to have a certain outcome, but your mental images are saying, it's not going to work, I'm going to fail, I won't have enough time. No matter how much effort you put in or how much will you have, the mental images are going to win. And so, if we can take the time to change our mental images to what we want and the direction that we want to go in, then our mind is going to guide us better towards our mental images. And with this, morning routine of just doing a quick visualization of all the things that you want to get done in that day and how you want the outcome to come out, unconsciously and naturally will kind of guide you in that direction. You'll find that during the day, you're not even putting as much effort because you've kind of given the mind the outcome you're seeking or the direction to go. And the unconscious just does everything in the background to help you achieve it.
Right. And even that evening routine of having everything written down, I
Mhm.
find allows for a better night's sleep. I got it out of my head. My mind doesn't have to race around all night thinking about it. It's just teed up for the next day. And then, maybe one thing I might add to that is, I know we all like to think we're really tough and we've got a lot of willpower, but hey, it's January, it's a new year, and you just look at how many New Year's resolutions last a very short amount of time. I think our willpower is extremely fleeting. What to me is a lot more powerful is routine and discipline and consistency that really enable things like ultimately willpower. So knowing that willpower is fragile, having a routine of repeating those visualizations, those mental images, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, you kind of touch on a few couple things that I want to riff on. One is the whole thing with willpower. In television and in movies and, at the gym, this talk of willpower and tough, it gets a lot of talk, but I don't think I agree with you that relying on willpower alone is not going to get you far. And what I find is in order to be productive and to stay consistent, because consistency is extremely important. And I know that you had a pretty big discussion about consistency with Sean Butcher in a podcast that you released a few weeks ago. But it's really these things that we do outside of the actual work that's going to help us do the work. And so things like the visualization and creating your to-do list the night before are really key things. And I want to kind of riff on the to-do list part because, having written a book on concentration and improving focus, this is one of the techniques I help people that I give people to help them get more focus. And the reason to-do lists are so important is because inside our mind, we have a lot of activity. We have thoughts running in and out. We have mental images flashing back and forth via daydreams or fantasies or other mental images. And then we also have a ton of emotions and feelings coursing every which way. And all of this activity actually competes for attention with what we're doing or with things from outside of our head. And it's really important to understand is all this activity is not there just for the sake of being there. It's there to kind of guide us and to help us move through the world. And one of the ways it does that is by reminding of things that we should be doing or need to get done. For example, I might be driving to the hardware store and I'll have a thought pop up saying, hey, don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning before it closes. Or I might be on this conversation and I'll get a twinge of fear that, hey, maybe I left the oven on. So throughout our day, our mind is tracking all these tasks and activities, and it is signaling to us what we need to get done and what we may not get done and whatnot. The problem is when we track too many things in our head, our mind gets overloaded. It's spending all its effort on tracking what to do as opposed to doing what we need to do. And I'm sure people have experienced this where they just have so much on their plate, they just can't take action. And the reason for that is because their mind is overloaded with just tracking about everything that we need to be doing. And the other challenge of that is that when we have too much in our head, too much going on in our head, it actually breaks our focus. So we might be working on a task, and then a thought come up saying, "Hey, don't forget this," and another thought might come up, "Hey, remember you have to go there." And as these reminders come up, it breaks our train of thought. And so it's really important to get all of these things out of our head and down on paper in the form of some sort of a to-do list or schedule. Because once we get it out of our head, the mind can feel more at ease. It knows that you're aware of what you need to get done. And then instead of using all the resources to track everything, it can use those resources to actually do those things.
How do you recommend, when you write about concentration, I noticed that you talk about the training the ability to maintain focus,
Yeah.
attention, I think ultimately productivity for hours at a time. But when you talk about the way our minds race around all those things that it's warning us that we still need to do, I guess I've always thought about productivity in shorter bursts, or it seems to me that there are sort of these laws of physics, like as much space as you have in your house, you're going to fill it up with junk. As much
Yeah.
time as you allow yourself in your schedule, your work is going to expand to that time box. So I've always thought about, I mean, if you try to sit in silence and concentrate without allowing other thoughts in, that's a very, very difficult thing for most of us to do for even a few seconds, which is, I
Yeah.
think, why I've thought about productivity and concentration in shorter bursts. So, could you talk about more about, as you're saying, our minds racing, what you recommend people do with all those thoughts or getting them down on paper, and how that can extend these bouts of concentration and productivity into hours long sessions?
Okay. So first, it really helps to understand that concentration is one of the most important skills that we can learn. And because it's so important, for some reason, it tends to be the most challenging. The things that seem to be easy aren't as important.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason concentration is so challenging is because the analogy I like to use is that developing concentration is like taming a wild animal or taming a wild beast. And the reason I use that analogy is because our unconscious mind actually comes from the wild. It evolved from hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Whereas our thinking mind, our human mind, the neocortex, has only been around for a few 100,000 years. And so, more or less, concentration is a battle. It's a battle between where you want to put your attention and focus versus where your unconscious is designed to put its attention and focus. And what's really important to understand is our older primitive parts have much more control and influence on us than our newer, more evolved parts of the brain. And so it usually tends to be the unconscious usually kind of wins. And so if concentration is a battle between your unconscious and your unconscious, it really helps to align your unconscious with your conscious desires, to get the unconscious to work with you on what it is you're wanting to do. So, if you are trying to do a task, but your unconscious wants to do something different, it actually becomes a battle. And that's where the difficulty and the challenge arises. But if, on the other hand, you want to work on a task and the unconscious is going to support you by giving you motivated feelings and help you focus, then it becomes a breeze. And so that's a really key thing to remember. And if it comes down to us aligning our unconscious with our conscious, one way to do that is that visual exercise. But another way that I find to be extremely, extremely helpful is self-talk. And self-talk, more or less, are statements that you say and repeat to yourself of the changes that you want to have or have happen in your life. For example, if I was shy and insecure and I wanted to be more confident, I would repeat statements like, I'm a strong, assertive person. I communicate my needs and wants. Now, it may not seem like affirming such statements would have that much effect, but it's huge. Self talk is a technique used by people in just about any discipline to perform at a very high level. And self talk works for several main reasons, but one of the main reasons is that those self-talk actually goes in and rewires your mind. So if you repeat a set of statements, those statements seep into our unconscious and bring out the the effects of what the statements are saying. So if I repeat statements like I'm a strong, assertive person, I actually start to become strong and assertive. If I repeat statements like I have an excellent memory, my memory improves. And if we repeat statements related to concentration, like I have strong power of concentration, I can focus on anything I choose, our focus and attention over time actually begins to improve.
So yeah, I know that the sort of the imagination, the imagined things in our mind, the brain doesn't really know the difference between
Yeah.
that and what's really happened in our lives or in our past. So that visualization is a way of convincing the brain of something that you want it to be. So I guess I hadn't realized that connection. So I know you also write pretty extensively, and you have a book around self-talk. So self-talk is one of the mechanisms that you recommend not only for concentration but for memory as well?
Yeah, self-talk is my go-to technique for any kind of change, improvement that anyone is seeking. To write a set of self-talk statements that describe the change or improvement that you want. So you would write maybe 8 to 12 statements that really hone in on what you're looking to achieve within a specific area, and then affirm those statements daily. And I have used self-talk in my own life for all sorts of things. I told you, when back in my past, I had a mind that was like really out of control. And out of control mind, you can't just like will yourself to keep it in check. you have to really go in and change what's going on internally for it to manifest something different. And self-talk was really key for that. Anytime I wanted to break a habit, I used self-talk to do that. If I wanted to improve a skill, I used self-talk as well. And I really can't stress self-talk enough if people use it the right way. And the right way is how I've described it, by creating a set of 8 to 12 statements that really hone in on a change that you want, and then repeating it on a daily basis.
Daily
So,
basis. Okay,
yeah.
gotcha.
So if you like, I have a set of self-talk statements that I can give to your listeners, specifically focused on concentration.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll follow up with you on that. I'd love to share that.
Okay, great.
Can we also talk about memory then as well? So you use that as an example of one of your potential self-talk statements, and you also have a book on memory. So how does that relate back? And it seems to me that the more we have that monkey mind racing around, it makes memory even more difficult.
Yeah, so memory is huge. I want people to understand that the most important thing that they can do is not rely on their natural mental processes to remember information. And that's because as humans, we forget up to 80% of what we hear, see, and learn within a few hours of hearing, seeing, and learning it. So that's not within a few months, weeks, or even a few days, but within a few hours. And what's more is that we rely on our memory to remember much more than that. We'll come across a great idea, an important instruction, a valuable advice, or a painfully obvious fact, and think that it's just too great, too important, too valuable, and too obvious to forget. And sure enough, we'll forget. And then we'll do it again. We'll come across an even greater idea, more important instruction, more valuable advice, and even more painfully obvious fact, and think that this time it's just too great and important to forget. And we'll forget again. And not only do we forget the thought or idea, but we'll forget that we even had one in the first place. It's as if we never received it. And majority of us are living our lives like this, constantly forgetting new information that's coming our way. And you hear the word that history repeats itself. Well, history repeats itself in our own lives because we're constantly doing the same things, making the same mistakes over and over again. And what I'd like to say to the listeners that majority of the advice that we're looking for, we've already come across probably several times. It's just that we forgot. And it's really important not to rely on something being important and valuable, because more than likely we'll forget. And there's like some really key reasons why we forget, if you'd like me to talk a little bit about that.
Please.
Okay. So our mind is designed to make us forget. It's actually built to make us forget things. And some people would ask, well, how could that be? Why would my mind make me forget? Well, there are advantages to forgetting. One is that majority of the information that we come across on a day-to-day basis is useful only for the short term. It's not useful for the long term. So it's important to have a mechanism in place that is designed to throw things out or forget what's unnecessary. Otherwise, our mind would become a cluttered mess, and sifting through that mess would be difficult and time consuming. Another reason we forget is that certain events and experiences are are painful. So thinking about them create overwhelming stress and anxiety. So as a defense mechanism, our mind will block out such memories so we can focus on what's important in the moment. But related to kind of what we're talking about today and mindsets and performance, a more important reason why we forget is that we humans are made up of different sets of mechanisms and processes. And for some of these mechanisms to do what they're designed to do, they'll make us forget. So one of the more commonly known mechanism is habit. Habits are designed to keep us in a routine or pattern of behavior. In their efforts, habits will do everything they can to ensure that we stick to that routine or pattern of behavior. If they didn't, they wouldn't be very good at what they did. Now, habits have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves. And one of them is to make us forget anything that goes against what we've been habitually ingrained to do. So let's say we read a great book and learn all these great ideas to organize our life. The problem is our habits of being messy goes against with being organized. So that habit of being messy is going to do everything in its power to make sure we forget all those ideas so we never even think about putting them into place. So there's all sorts of reasons why we can't or can't do things. One of the main reasons comes down to us forgetting.
And then, so how do we flip that around, understanding why the brain is designed and works that way for survival and otherwise? So how do we flip that around into better memory?
Okay, so one is to realize that if we come across important advice, just because it's important and valuable, that we're not to know that we're not just going to instantly remember it. In fact, majority of the people listening to this podcast will probably forget most of what they hear, and even you and I, Michael, will probably forget it. It's not a matter of if or but more about when. And I'm not trying to be cynical or pessimistic or trying to say that, you know, people don't have a good memory. It's just the way our mind works. So if we can understand that, then we understand why it's important to improve our memory or to do something to remember what we're learning. And one of the best ways to do that is with a technique called retrieval. Retrieval is the act of recalling information that we have read, heard, or watched from memory instead of rereading, rehearing, or rewatching it. So, for example, after listening to a podcast like this, what you would do is think about everything that you had learned without going back and listening to the podcast again. And what we want to do is get into the habit of recalling information as much as possible. And the more we do that, the more we'll be able to retain what it is that we've learned. And so we can use retrieval in two ways. One is to do a daily review at the end of the day, and the other is to retrieve information right after we've come across it. So let's say after reading a book or listening to a podcast, once it's over, we kind of just go in our mind and go back and think about everything that was discussed and try to see what key takeaways were presented, and then go back to the podcast and see if we remembered everything correctly. Or the other way is at the end of the day, you try to retrieve everything that came across that day, including what you learned, just so it stays on top of mind.
So is it repetition then that's really solidifying the memory?
It is a form of repetition, and both repetition and retrieval are very effective. Um, so really, when it comes to memory, repetition is the mother of all learning. And so you want to repeat the information as soon as possible, as often as possible, and in as many ways as possible. And retrieval is just one form of repetition that allows you to expose yourself to that information. But the reason retrieval specifically works so well and why I've suggested it as like the key memory technique is because a challenge of memory is not with putting information into your brain. That's actually quite easy and natural for the brain to do. The real challenge is in getting that information out. And I'll give you a couple examples to illustrate. You know, if I were to ask you to sing lyrics to your favorite song, right here and right now, you might probably have a challenge doing so. But if the song were playing in the background, you could probably sing along to the tune with no problem. Or if I ask you for specific memories from childhood, it may not come up. But if I show you an old toy from childhood, everything will you'll be taken back to that time like you were there yesterday. You'll remember when you got the toy, all the places you played with it, and everything in between. Now, these examples illustrate that memories can be in our head and seem like they're lost and forgotten. The reason they seem like they're lost and forgotten is that we haven't practiced getting the information out. And retrieval helps us practice getting information out. And if we can regularly practice getting information out that we've learned, then we can actually use that information and apply it. As opposed to if we just read something and went back and reviewed it, that doesn't do anything to actually get the information out.
Okay. I'm fascinated by that. I've never, that I recall, that we're talking about memory, I've never practiced retrieval to try to build that skill.
Yeah,
So I want to read more and learn more from you about that. If I maybe use this as a segue to, you also write about speed reading. So I was
yeah,
just thinking about what we might learn that is in our brain, as you said, seems like maybe it's lost. I mean, I think about learning something very methodically, whether it was listening or watching or reading, no matter how slowly and I go through it and try to make sure I remember. As you said,
hmm,
I'm gonna forget the vast majority of it. So one of
yeah,
my concern, I've never learned speed reading, but one of my concerns was, well, is this really a viable technique, or am I just going to bypass a lot of information that I won't actually absorb and won't remember? So can you talk a bit about your techniques for reading and productivity in that, and you know, relate it back to memory? Is it
sure.
still an effective way to absorb and then be able to retrieve the same amount of information?
Yes. So the challenge with remembering is not necessarily directly related to us or the quantity of information that we're absorbing. It's more related to the fact that do we do something afterwards to make sure that we retain it? Because, like I said, as humans, we forget as much as 80% of what we hear, see, and learn. And this is just the way the mind is built. It's not something that we can really fight it unless we take action to remember that information. So we can learn lots of information and we can be methodical about it. But if we don't do anything to retain it, then we won't be able to hold on to it. And I can give an example of why, repetition is important, or why it's really important to do something later on to remember information. And it's because of the mechanical limit of the brain. Anytime a memory is formed, grooves or tracks are created in the brain. And you can think of these grooves or tracks like footprints or breadcrumbs that lead to a specific memory. The more we repeat a certain thought, idea, or piece of data, the more those grooves or tracks deepen, making it easier for the brain to find that specific piece of information. Now, what's really important to understand is that those grooves or tracks, they don't deepen by how important, valuable the information is or how methodical you were in learning it. They deepen simply by repeating the information, which is why it's so easy to remember a commercial jingle and so hard to remember something as in a meeting, because that commercial jingle has been repeated so often, it's been locked into our mind. But if we didn't repeat something else that was more important, it didn't matter how important and valuable it was, it just wouldn't get recorded. So kind of took a long explanation to pretty much come to the point where it's not so much how much information we're taking in, it's what we're doing to be able to remember it later. And so with speed reading, there are different techniques that allow you to take in a lot of information at a very short time. And if we do something to hold on to that afterwards, we will retain that. And what I really recommend people do is what I call review and recall. So after you read a chapter in a book, you close that book and try to recall or retrieve as much as you can without going back to the book or your notes. So this is where we're using retrieval and practicing getting information out. And we try to call up as much details just on our own. And then once we've done that, we go back to the book or in our notes and see how much of it we remembered. And just that act will reinforce that information better and help us remember it longer.
That's okay. Okay, so if I got you right, our brains are designed to forget the vast majority of what we take in, and that makes sense. There's just so many stimuli that we pick up through all of our senses in the world, and then it almost sounds like the design is to hold a number of these things in sort of short-term memory. You mentioned for a number of hours, and then if there's not some reason that it sees to hold on to those, then they may be discarded, unless we do something, as you mentioned, either right after or hopefully a few hours later in a daily review to deepen those grooves, deepen those tracks, to reinforce or to say, hey, this is something we need to hang on to. And then if I've got that right, so then in speed reading, there are maybe techniques to read faster, but then in terms of memory, you're saying it's not about methodical reading. It's about review and recall, maybe chapter by chapter, to deepen those grooves.
Yes, yes. I think you have encapsulated it perfectly. And if you or your audience would like to hear a really great speed reading technique, there's this one technique I had developed that I found many people to have triple their reading in a matter of seconds. Would you guys be interested in that?
Lay it on me.
Okay, so I'll talk first about how I kind of developed it so you can understand why it could work so well. Is I've always struggled with reading, and I always had challenges with being able to read fast, and also being focused on what I was reading. And then I thought to myself, why is it reading is such a slow and tedious process? I mean, when I look up into my room or environment, I can see and make sense of everything instantly. I don't go, if I were in the kitchen, I wouldn't be like, well, this is a table and this is a chair and this has a handle and it's a metal thing. So this is a pan. Excuse me. None of that happens. I look in my kitchen and the connection to everything is made instantly. So I thought to myself, why couldn't we do that with reading? And the thing is, we can. It's just that the traditional way we read, we're looking at word by word. And when we look at each individual word, our eyes focus on that specific word. So our eyes have the ability to focus on a specific detail and look at something in the bigger and grander picture. By focusing on individual words, it narrows our focus, and so we're forced to read word for word. What I recommend people do is not to look at the words, but the spaces in between the words. And it sounds a little out there, but trust me on this. When you look at the spaces in between the words, the focus of your eyes, they don't narrow, so they can capture more words to the left and right of that space. So if people can pull out a book and or a piece of text, and what I recommend is that they go from one space to the next between every 2 to 3 words, and you'll be able to take it in much quicker.
Wow. Okay. So is it still and I know I've read, and you can go get these sort of mental tricks to play around with, that we think we're focused on an entire word, but in reality, our brain is not. Maybe it sees the first and last letter and it fills it in, or you might even have partial letters if you look at some of these exercises, and your brain is still filling them in from the patterns that it learned as it learned these symbols that we call words and written representation of language. So is this the same idea, that I don't actually have to focus on a letter? I don't have to focus on a word. Now I'm going to focus on the space between 2 or 3 words, and my brain is still going to get that phrase as opposed to the word itself.
Yeah, it's not technically the same idea because when you're just focusing on the spaces between every 2, 3, or 4 words, what's happening is that you're using your eyes the way they are used when we're looking at everything else in our environment. The eyes have the ability to absorb a lot more information. And with a technique like this, what happens is that traditional forms of reading, you look at the word and then your mind has to process that word and then make sense of it. With this technique, the looking and the processing happen instantaneously. So you can just skip from one space to another very rapidly, and the mind just takes in information. It's almost as if it's inhaling information.
Hmm. And is it, so if I just think about what that's going to feel like for me, if I relate it to, so I'll just, if I describe visual focus, I think of it as I can really acutely focus on something, and it sort of has the effect of narrowing my peripheral vision. But
Yeah.
if I soften that gaze just a little bit, I don't completely space out, but soften it just a little bit, the kind of the overall footprint of what we can take in broadens. Is
Yeah.
it similar to that feeling?
It's similar to that. Yes, that's exactly what's happening, where your eyes are just able to capture more to the left and right of the space than if you put your attention on the word, where all you can see is that specific word.
Wow. Okay. And so that's something that people can, I mean, obviously that's very quick to describe. And if it's just the space between two words, then you're going to practically double your
Yeah.
speed. Is that something that takes a while to practice to learn to do effectively?
It doesn't take a lot to do effectively. All you have to do is pick up a piece of text and just start with a space, maybe 3 words into the sentence, and then skip to a space, 3 words after that, and then 3 words after that. And if you just focus on just bouncing your gaze from one space to another, you're reading triple the speed in a matter of seconds. The challenge that comes with it is to actually do it, because we're habitual beings, and the way our habits work, even if the change is something simple, it still takes a lot of time and effort to do. So it'll take a little bit of effort to break that habit of looking at spaces versus looking at the words. But once a reader can do that, essentially they can, like I say, inhale information, and you can actually progress yourself from going from space, looking at a space between every 3 words to every 4 words, and then over time every 5 words, and you can literally take in a lot of information without too much effort.
Okay. Well, thanks for setting the expectation that it's going to take some repetition, some practice, breaking the old habit.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to take too much of your time, Cam. This is all really fascinating. So, maybe to hit a couple more topics fairly quickly. So, thinking about how to be successful in speeding up reading, and a lot of this that we've talked about today has come out of your own challenges or struggles earlier in life. So, congratulations on everything you're doing. What what would you say, whether it's past or sort of now or even looking forward, what are currently your biggest challenges, or what are some of your biggest failures? What have they been, and how is that maybe driving what you're going to do here going out into the future, and what you're writing and what you're speaking about?
All right, so this is kind of a tough question. What are some of my biggest challenges I'm facing right now, or some of the biggest failures? I know, having listened to a few of your podcasts, the topic of failure has kind of come up, and how important failure was to success. And some of the interviewees had even mentioned that essentially they failed their way to success. And that's how I kind of look at my life. I go in with the expectation that I'm not going to be good at something and things aren't going to work out, but that's how I'm going to learn to grow and move forward. But if I were to talk about one of my biggest failures, it would be, the reason I've written 10 books is because I talked about how I was so nervous about public speaking, professional speaking, and presenting myself. In fact, I was so nervous that every time I would finish a book, instead of going out and marketing it, I would write another book. And it was very unconscious. I didn't realize where this urge to write another book came from. I just felt like, oh, wow, this is another great idea. And I think people would find it useful and I should write about it. And then once I got into writing, I was like, well, I am writing right now, so I don't really have time to go market myself. And don't get me wrong, my book sales did really not really well, but enough where I didn't have to put myself out there. But I was avoiding putting myself out there, and I didn't know that I was avoiding doing that. And I thought I was using writing more books as a way to avoid that. So I would say my biggest failures right now that I'm trying to overcome is this block of just putting myself out there more, and talking more and speaking more about my content, and letting the world know what I have done and how what I have gone through to be able to do it.
That's amazing. That's a good one. Yeah, thanks for the vulnerability and the transparency to share that one, and certainly something I think many of us can relate to. It's really easy to get distracted, kind of lose our focus from what we probably ought to be doing or working on, and in ways that we think are productive or neat or
Yeah.
useful, but they're probably just avoiding something
Yeah.
ultimately. So kudos on that, and I'm glad to hear the book's doing so well. I know it gives you an opportunity to do many things like travel, which
Yeah.
I am. I love to travel as well. It sounds like you have been many places. I know this is an unfair question, but do you have a favorite? I know that's tough to answer, or if that's a tough one, maybe where are you excited to go next that you haven't been?
Okay, so I'll try to answer all of that. Yes, I have traveled quite a bit, and a lot of what I've kind of learned about human behavior and animal behavior, and some of the ideas I've come across is through my travels. And I don't think you mentioned, but I have traveled to nearly 100 countries around the world. And if I were to pick, I can't say I have a favorite, but I can give you my top five.
Great.
All right. So number five would be Turkey. Number four is Ethiopia. Number three is New Zealand. Number two is Venezuela. And number one is Colombia. And I had a very strict criteria to get to this top five, and it involved, just how friendly the people were, how much nature was in the country, or how beautiful the nature was, as well as like the history and the culture, and just where that country has come from. And so that's where I've kind of made how I made the top five. But New Zealand, doesn't really have a lot of history and culture per se, but it made my top five strictly because of the nature. Because there's amazing nature all over the world. But New Zealand is just like a tad bit better. It's just on this higher level. It has things that other places I haven't seen have. So that's the reason New Zealand made the top five.
Oh yeah, amazing place, amazing friendly people. That's gotta put it up there as well. And I think the indigenous Maori Pacific Islander culture is pretty interesting as well. I'll say this to maybe to the chagrin of some of my Aussie buddies, but I've been to New Zealand twice and Australia twice, I think, and I
Nice.
run across people who hit both in the same trip, and just by way of sheer size, they proportion the trip that way, and they go, well, we set it up for 4 weeks in Australia and 1 week in New Zealand. And
Yeah.
then they get to New Zealand and they go, holy cow, I should have done it the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing against Australia. I mean, Australia's got really amazing nature and wildlife as well. And with New Zealand, I do want to riff on, yeah, the people are great. And the Maori culture, like, I really enjoyed interacting with the Maoris. They really made me feel home and welcome. And I do want to ditto that. There's so many cool things to see, and they're in such close proximity to each other that yeah, like New Zealand's just a great spot.
Yeah, can't go wrong there. Well, thank you so much, Cam. Super interesting talking to you. I really look forward to reading your books. Before we wrap up, let's just talk about where people should find you, where they can find the books and your website and your podcast and the other things you do. And then I think you also have, you've been very generous in some actionable ideas here today on the talk, but I think you also have some free resources people can download and go a little deeper.
Yes, I do. So I do some coaching. So if people want to reach out just for the coaching aspect, they can reach out to Cam, Kam, at mindlily.com. And then my website is mindlily.com, mindlily.com. And they can learn more about my books, my online course that I put together. Also, I have a blog with a lot of great content, as well as some free articles. But if they really wanted to skyrocket their speed reading, concentration, and memory, I have a book called Triple Your Reading, Memory, and Concentration in 30 Minutes. And they can get that at mindlily.com/free, which is mindlily.com/free.
Excellent. I just pulled that down myself, and it looks like there is an audio component as well.
Yes, there is.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Cam. I really enjoyed it. Looking forward to getting this out to our Man of Mastery community. There's tons of stuff here, and we didn't even get into your mind mapping techniques, which you have 2 books on, I believe. So
Yes.
love to have you back another time and talk further. I'm gonna definitely drive into the speed reading. I'm a huge reader, so I really want to try that. Hope it speeds up my ability to continue to learn more and share with people here. It's just such a great way to, as you say, get outside your comfort zone, but have a chance to meet people like you and learn things like this. So I super appreciate your time and really appreciate you sharing with the audience.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. It was a pleasure to be on. And if you're really interested in sparking that speed of yours with the reading, that book, The Triple Your Reading, Memory and Concentration, which you can get at mindlily.com free, the first few pages really make it easy for readers to understand the technique that I talked about. Because, talking about it in words without having like a visual cue can be a little bit challenging, but once they grab that book, they'll be able to see just how easy it is.
Okay, perfect. Well, show notes for this episode, I will put links not only to your website, make sure I'll get your email out there as well, cam@mindlily.com, but also the free resource with that, not only for more information, but actually a practice guide to put this into practice.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks so much, Cam. I really appreciate it. All right. Yeah, great stuff. I think that's super cool, not only as a tool set, but in the way that Cam has really taken his own hardship and failures and challenges and turned them around, not only into ways that work for him and going out and finding those things, but he's become an authority himself, an expert in these things. And he's here to share it with us and others. So, in fact, look forward to having him back soon to dive deeper into concentration as a practice, as well as his tools for mind mapping. That's it for this week. I'd love to hear what you thought about the episode and Cam's tools, put them to use, and how they go for you. Reach out on social media at The Man of Mastery on Instagram or Facebook. Shoot me a message or a post. Love to hear about your application of Cam's tools and how they work for you. Also, if you are new and you haven't yet rated the podcast, I would really appreciate if you go out to iTunes and give us some feedback in terms of a rating and any comments you might have around that. It super helps the show and the rating algorithms with Apple. All right, that's it for this week, guys. Have a great week. Next week, I will be back with, I call him the real life Indiana Jones, coming up next week on the Man of Mastery podcast.